So hi everyone, I'll just give it a couple of 30 seconds or so to wait for the numbers to go up and the people entering the room. Right, we've hit 70, so I think I'll start. So hello everyone, hope you're well, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name's Nathan Yole. I'm the Executive Director of Progressive Britain. So this is the first Progressive Britain event of 2022, and actually it's the first in what will be a year-long programme of events on Labour's history and its relevance today, and actually how we can promote a much greater and better understanding of Labour's past. And we're running this programme of events in conjunction with two partner organisations. The first is the Labour Party research unit at Anglia Ruskin University, and Rowan McWilliam, who's one of the co-directors of the unit, I think is hopefully going to be on, well, he'll be one of you watching the webinar this evening. And we're also running it with the Ties of History website and Twitter feeds that I know many of you follow, and actually a few more of you follow Ties of History now than Progressive Britain, which is a bit of a battle I can see happening over the course of the year. So thank you also to Anthony Broxton, who is the main contributor and runs the Twitter feed. I mean, hopefully, as if by magic now, the Twitter handles of both of those organisations should appear in the chat box. So this programme has been called Rethinking Labour's Past, and actually it will be supporting and promoting a book that we've got coming out next Thursday of the same name. Which essentially was my lockdown project, but it will be drawing together some insights from, I think, 15 leading political scientists and historians who've taken a revisionist look at various aspects of Labour's history. And basically the contention is that by gaining a better understanding of Labour's past, we can actually use those understandings as a foundation for that progressive political project that we know that Keir needs to take into Downing Street at the next election. So there should be a link to the publication page of the Bloomsbury website and a 25% discount code in the chat box right now. If you're joining us from outside the UK, please drop one of us a line and I'll see what I can do. So back to tonight's event. And honestly, guys, I promise I did not give Sue Gray a backhander, a brown paper envelope full of Mohammed Al Fayed's money to ensure that she published her report into the goings on in Downing Street this afternoon, but quite honestly, I really couldn't have planned for better timing this evening. I think now it's fair comment to say that the shine has come off Boris Johnson's government. The bust up over Owen Paterson, allegations of blackmail against former Tory MP Christian Wakeford and others, if rumours are to be believed, questions over the rescue of Penn Farthing's animals from Afghanistan, renewed interest in the scandal of PPE contracts and the resignation of Lord Agnew. And now, today, the most serious blow yet is Sue Gray's damning verdict of a serious failure to observe high standards in number 10 Downing Street throughout the course of the pandemic. So tonight, to kick off our programme of events, we're going to investigate what role Tory scandals have played and can play in the election of Labour governments. And I guess more properly, how they have shaped public opinion and have helped create the political conditions necessary for a Labour victory. We're going to take a deep dive into the contemporary situation, then go back to the early 1960s, to the time of the Profumo scandal and of the falling days of the Macmillan and Douglas Hume regimes, and how Tory sleaze and corruption in the early 60s helped promote Harold Wilson to number 10. Then we're going to jump forward to the 1990s and how cash for access and back to basics all helped contribute the feeling that, again, it was time for a change that saw New Labour come through the middle and win the general election in 1997. And we're also going to ask whether there are now systemic issues at play that potentially make corruption in UK politics inevitable. So joining us this evening, and in the order they're going to speak, we've got Paula Surridge, a leading sociologist from Bristol University and currently a Deputy Director of UK in a Changing Europe. Paula is also one of the co-authors of the 2019 general elections study that came out again in paperback earlier on in the this year. Paula is going to talk us through exactly what is going on with the polling and how all these allegations swirling around number 10 are affecting Boris Johnson and his government. After Paula, we've got Steve Richards, leading commentator for many publications over the years, including The New Statesman and The Independent. Steve's now well known for his rock and roll politics podcast, but again, also for his recent books looking at the best prime ministers from Wilson to May, and also more latterly his book on the best prime ministers we never had from Rab Butler forwards. And then our final speaker tonight probably needs very little introduction to this audience, but is Dame Margaret Hodge, the MP for Barking since 1994, minister throughout the Blair and Bryan government since between 2010 and 2015, chair of the Public Accounts Select Committee. Steve is going to be taking us back, like I said, to looking at the 60s and the 90s. Margaret is going to basically start off with her thoughts on what it was like to be a by-election candidate in the 1990s and the energy that the falling or the failure of the Tory government gave to Labour as we were readying ourselves for power. But Margaret is also going to talk about a report she has coming out hopefully next month, being published by King's College London, which is looking at the potential correlation between dirty money and dirty politics in the UK. So that's enough from me. So just to say, each contributor has been given sort of between 8 and 10 minutes. I will take the 3 of them in order. Then we will start a conversation and a discussion. If anybody, the chat function is open, so those of you in the audience can chat between yourselves and make comments about what the contributors are saying. But if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom function, and myself, Joseph, and Tom will fish them out and ask questions to Paula, to Steve, and to Margaret after they've finished speaking. So I think that's all the housekeeping I have to tell you. So Paula, it's over to you.
Thank you. Just share my screen, which always just takes a minute or two to make it actually work properly. Are we good? Hopefully everybody can see the slide there, even if the white background's decided to disappear very slightly. So first of all, some apologies, because like everybody else, I spent the last 2.5 hours glued to the television rather than practicing my slides and polishing the analysis. So if it's a little bit less polished than it might normally be, my apologies. It took me a little bit by surprise this afternoon. But I wanted to talk through a little bit about the current polling, a little bit about why these kinds of scandals can do so much damage, and then perhaps a few words of caution about relying only on scandal in order to win elections. 1 second, it doesn't want to change. There we go. So first of all, I thought I'd start off with this poll tracker from YouGov, which on first sight seems to sit very easily with the idea that the kind of initialisation of the Partygate scandal just before Christmas pushed Labour to a polling lead. The timing seems to fit quite well. Labour move into the lead in late November, early December in terms of this polling. But I want to also show you another piece of evidence, just as some background to what I'm going to say. And this is the longer time series from Ipsos Mori. Both pollsters show very, very similar time series. The Conservative and Labour leads are very similar across the board. But Ipsos Mori do their polling on the same day every month. And they put out some polling just before the Owen Paterson scandal broke. And that polling had fieldwork done before any of this had hit the news headlines, before any of it had appeared in Parliament, before anybody was talking about it. And that poll in early November was already showing a 1 percentage point Labour lead, a tie in statistical terms. But nonetheless, it was the first time in this series there was that very small lead. And if we look at that blue line that shows the Conservative vote over that period, you can see that starts to fall well before any of these scandals hit the headlines. So the Conservative Party vote was already weakening before we hit this current wave of scandals, tsunami of scandals. That's too many S's in the same sentence. It was already weakening. And I think that will be important to come back to. And I think it's important to bear in mind that although things have certainly accelerated since, some of the seeds of polling change and people and some of the shine, as Nathan put it, coming off the Conservative government was happening before the scandals actually broke. Now I'm going to take us back in time very briefly to try and unpick why some of these scandals matter. Now, I haven't looked at polling data specifically in the long term because methodology has changed so much. It's very difficult to compare a poll from the early 1990s with a poll now. Then we were talking about almost entirely telephone polling. Now we're almost entirely online. We know from the 1992 election that the polls weren't always telling quite the right story in that period. So it's very difficult to make those kinds of comparisons. But the time series that I'm using here is the British Social Attitude Survey, whose methodology hasn't changed during this period, with the exception of the most recent survey in 2020, which had to move online because of the pandemic. But across this time series, otherwise, you have a consistency of methodology. And we have this same question that's been asked going back to 1986. There is one law for the rich and one law for the poor. And you can see that across this period, there are really high levels of people in Britain who agree with that statement. Right at the start of the period, we're talking 60%. It rises during that period of crisis that you're going to come to talk about during the 1990s. You can see it does rise to a peak of just above 70%, and then falls again during the first part of the Blair years, between 97 on to 2004. And we can see it had ticked up again just a little bit in 2020. And I'm not a gambling woman, but were I would say it's going to tick up again when they measure it in 2021. That data hasn't been released yet. What that means is that there are really high proportions of people in Britain who think that this is how the world works anyway. Most of them don't want it to be like that, but they think that's how the world works. So in some senses, scandals like the ones we're seeing around people not following the rules, around fast tracks for PPE and so on, play into people's pre-existing worries about how the political system works. Why this matters even more in the current moment is if we take a look at who thinks this, who's most likely to think there's one law for the rich and one law for the poor. The previous chart, I was showing you anybody who agreed or strongly agreed with the statement. And the problem with doing it like that is that such high levels of people either agree or strongly agree, we don't see much variation. If we look at just those who strongly agree with this position, though, you can see some interesting differences emerge. Only 14% of those who voted Conservative in 2017 and Conservative in 2019 strongly agree with this statement. Over half of those that voted Labour in 2017 and Labour in 2019 agree with this statement. But perhaps in the current political moment, the group that's really of interest to us are those who voted Labour in 2017 and switched to the Conservatives in 2019. And 1 in 3, roughly, of that group strongly agree with this statement. And I think this speaks to their underlying values, which is something I'm very interested in as a political sociologist, of what a fair and just society should look like, what politics should look like, and a sense that actually there are people who are not playing by the rules, who are using their position in order to gain favour of one kind or another. I think it also explains why in some of the current polling we're seeing, there's being a particularly big impact of this tsunami of scandals in places that swung heavily behind the Conservatives in 2019. So those voters that have this strong sense of fair play, but also a sense that those with money are able to get ahead in ways that are not entirely fair. I want to now just add a word of caution to some of that. So yes, a scandal like this is potentially good news for Labour. It potentially makes those voters that have swung from Labour to the Conservatives particularly angry, particularly likely to turn against the government. And we've seen a whole raft of recent polls with Labour having about a 10 percentage point lead. I think we've seen 2 today, or maybe 1 yesterday, 1 today from Delta Poll and Redfield and Wilton. And I just want to introduce a note of caution into that in terms of what scandals do and how they change public opinion. So if we dive sort of beneath the hood a little bit on this poll, this particular poll, I just happened to pick the most recently released YouGov poll because it allows me to dive into the data a little bit more deeply, but you can see this pattern repeated. If we take those who voted Conservative in 2019, this particular poll has just over half of them saying that they would vote Conservative again. That shouldn't surprise us. In fact, the fact it's so low is what should surprise us there. Around 5% in this poll of those Conservative voters say they would now vote Labour. And in some of the more recent polling, the Delta poll in particular, I looked at this morning, that figure's quite a bit higher. It's as high as 10, even 13% in some of the polling. Sorry, excuse me. And 4% saying they would switch to Reform UK. And I think there are some interesting questions there around why, at the moment at least, disaffected Conservatives are not heading for Reform UK as the answer to their problems. But the really important figure here is that 1 in 4 don't know who they would vote for. And we saw similar figures to this not last November. We've changed a year. I only changed years in September because I change on academic years, but we have actually changed a year since then. And if we go back to October, November 2020, we saw a similar pattern emerging in the polls. But what happened was, after the vaccine rollout, those don't know started to go back to the Conservatives. And therefore, the gap between Labour and Conservatives closes. So the task for Labour, if it wants to win an election, is to convert those don't knows to Labour voters. So the way I think about it is the scandals have sown doubts, have kind of shaken people loose a little bit, detached them a little bit from the Conservative Party. But Labour needs to do something more. It needs to do more than just not be the party involved in the scandals in order to bring those don't knows over to being Labour supporters. So I'm aware of the time and I don't want to take too long. I just want to offer a few thoughts then on this scandal and the polling and what we might read from it. Is this scandal different, I think, is something that's worth asking in the context of what we're looking at here tonight. And I think one of the things that makes it different, we can all get angry about cash for questions, and we can all get angry about people breaking rules. But this is something that is far more personal. There is so much unresolved grief. And Keir Starmer spoke about the guilt in Parliament today. So much of that still around, that this scandal feels personal to people in a way that others, I don't think, have. People can be angry about expenses, but you don't feel personally affected by it in quite the same way. And I don't think we know really quite how that will play out. I think we've still got a long way to go in understanding people's emotional fallout from the pandemic. The second thing is that this scandal is happening in a period where the electorate are particularly volatile. And the parts of the electorate who have been the most volatile in recent elections, who have swung the most between the parties, are those voters who are most likely to take issue with people rule breaking, with people using their positions of power to get around the rules. So I think that's another factor here, that this gives this the potential to be an even bigger impact on electoral outcomes than some of the earlier scandals. But I would caution all that with, I think the anger on its own won't be enough, and there's a danger of it sliding into a kind of disillusionment with the whole political process and a sense of kind of apathy. It doesn't matter, nothing we do changes anything unless the opposition, the Labour Party, can find something positive to come out of it and can offer people some kind of optimistic vision rather than just channeling the anger that's around at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic, Paula. I think that definitely sets us up, gives quite a comprehensive overview of where we are currently and how it's playing with the public. So Steve, it falls to you now to take us back in time 60 years or so and set the scene, what it was like in the 1960s, and to actually talk people through, because presumably there are many people on the call who have a shaky knowledge or understanding what was happening in the early 60s. because my take on it has always been that was the first time where sleaze corruption really sort of made it through into the public and actually had a shocking effect on public opinion and how politicians were seen. And then obviously Harold Wilson was able to capitalise on that quite expertly for the time. So Steve, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to preface this by saying I was in my cot when Harold Wilson was making the most of this. I wasn't living through it, but I do know about it. And it is interesting and relevant that the two elections Labour have won from opposition, it's only two, 64 and 97, sleaze was a big issue. Bigger than in previous elections that Labour tended to lose. Well, not tended, lost. So you mentioned the Profumo affair and the whole Christine Keeler thing, and with John Major, the whole sleaze. Sleaze wasn't a term in the early 60s, but again, there was a sense of scandal around, in many ways unfairly, I think, with Major. It tormented him more than anything else because he was a figure, I think, of some integrity. But in both cases, it helped Labour hugely. Why? I think there are two reasons. One is a sort of symbolism of long-serving governments falling into a kind of decay. And nothing illustrates this more vividly than a perception of wrongdoing. And both the leaders of the Labour Party in the early 60s and the mid-90s exploited it brilliantly. Every opportunity was taken with sleaze and the other symptoms of an exhausted government by Wilson, who appeared young and modern, although actually if you look at the photos now, he looks quite old, even though he wasn't. So for example, in the midst of all the sleaze, Macmillan famously sacked a vast number of his cabinet ministers in the so-called Night of the Long Knives. And Wilson popped up, and this is an important thing for the leader of the opposition to do. You cannot just appear to wallow in it, you've got to frame it in a way that is accessible. After the Night of the Long Knives, Wilson just popped up and said, I see the Prime Minister sacked half his cabinet, the wrong half. And immediately he both ridiculed the then Prime Minister and conveyed a sense of chaos by that framing. So it partly helped to symbolize decay, Russian spies, sex, and all the rest of it in the early 60s. And similarly in the mid-90s, the same kind of ingredients played their part. You know, when John Major talked about back to basics, he wasn't talking actually about ministerial or MPs' private lives, but it became about sex and mistrust and cash in brown envelopes and all the rest of it, which fueled a sense that was already there of decay. And once again, Blair brilliantly seized on the symbolism at every opportunity. And there is another issue, and Paul has basically referenced it, so I won't say it, which is it's not just symbolic, there is substance to it. This idea of one rule for the rulers and another for everybody else remains potent if you are not one of the rulers but seek to rule, because you can then frame arguments about how you will do it differently. And for Labour in particular, that's a very useful area, because it's not about spending money, which is the area Labour always agonises over in the build-up to elections. It's about standards and conduct. And if you remember, Blair famously said in the build-up to 97, to torment Major, we will be purer than pure. And indeed, at one point, and he regretted it, he regretted quite a lot of this actually, he said, even if a minister is seen as being impure, not whiter than white, they will go, which is a far too high a bar. If you think anyone would be alleged to do anything, they're off. But it was to torment Major, which he did very successfully. So there is the argument that suggests that, and I won't talk much about the current situation because it is obvious. This is sleaze, in inverted commas, on a scale far, far deeper than anything from the early 60s and the mid 1990s. As I said, remember Major's cabinet was Major himself, Heseltine, Clark. No one was accusing them personally of lying to Parliament, of setting rules, breaking them, and then lying about it in the biggest national emergency since 1945. So this is off the scale compared to the early 60s and the mid 1990s, and is a gift, therefore, for Labour. And it suits wholly, you all saw Keir Starmer's response today to Johnson. It's been widely praised, and it suits him wholly, former DPP, etc. So those are the sort of suggestions that this is the terrain which helps Labour to win. But I'd offer a couple of cautionary thoughts as well. First of all, as I said, Tony Blair has subsequently said he regretted the whole focus on sleaze in the mid-1990s, because every prime minister in modern British politics comes under attack for lying and misconduct. He did. Gordon Brown did. And so he now says they shouldn't have done all that on sleaze with Major. Wilson never said the same thing, but it is interesting that one of the winners regretted the focus. That's not my advice to Keir Starmer now. This has to be gone again and again, because, as I say, it's on a different scale. But there are problems with this terrain in that it can infect everybody in politics. And Tony Blair found that when he was being accused of the same kinds of things, he too was tormented, and he thought it was unfair too. So there are dangers. The other thing is that while it unquestionably in 64 and 97 helped Labour win, I don't think it was the key ingredient. The key ingredient always has to be, with Labour, the ability to combine reassurance with excitement. And it can't just reassure, and nor can it just help to excite. It needs to do both. And so I still think the essence of the Wilson win in 64 and Blair in 97 had partly to do with the fading of long-serving governments and the sleaze associated with them. But it also had to do with the artistry of opposition, which is to, as I say, reassure and excite. Wilson appeared the more modern figure in 64, as Blair did in 97. Now, modern means a lot of things. It partly does mean keeping to higher standards than you accuse your opponents of, but it means many other things too. So although if Labour wins next time, what's happening now, irrespective of whether Johnson is replaced or not, will be a factor propelling it towards power after 4 terms of government. Major, it was after 4 terms. It will not be alone enough. There has to be that sense of excitement about the alternative, whilst voters also can't feel threatened by it. So those, I think, are the lessons of 64 and 97 in relation to sleaze.
Thanks for that, Steve. And actually, this is not the essay question I set you earlier on, but I'm just thinking, going back further then, can you think of any prime minister, any government at any point in the last 300 years where this level of corruption, potential scandal has become so wound up in the person of that leading politician, to the extent that actually it is the prime minister's own failings and his predilections that are actually at the eye of this storm? Is it a case we have to go back to sort of like the mid-18th century for anything to be?
Well, I don't know what I can't remember. I wasn't looking at the mid-18th century, but my answer, without qualification, usually you have to hedge around these things, is no, for exactly the reasons Paula suggested. This is one that voters live through in a way that they still feel with great intensity, the pandemic and the rules. And therefore, for example, just the news today, and it was more dramatic today than I thought it was going to be, of all the photos going to the police, Sue Gray was clearly aching to find a way of writing something that landed him in a degree of trouble today, and she did. So no, I mean, we know about Lloyd George and all these others and dodgy things going on, but I don't think there is something on this accessible, highly emotional scale that I can think of with any other prime minister in sort of modern times. So it is to put it at its electoral crudity, it is quite a gift for the main opposition party, inevitably. But I say it's not alone going to propel it to power.
So I think it's a fair point. I agree with you. Before I bring Margaret in, just to reiterate with everyone, I forgot to tell you earlier on what the hashtag was for the Twitterati amongst you, although I did put it in the chat function. So the hashtag is #Rethinking Labour. So any comments, please put the hashtag in. And also, we've had one comment in the question and answer session thus far, and so far Steve and Paula have been sort of comprehensive in their comments, so I can understand why they might have been scared off the pitch and have nothing to ask. But please put your questions in the Q&A function. If you put them in the chat, one of us will try and fish them out. I've taken a few down myself, but unfortunately, Steve and Paula, you were answering the questions before I had a chance to ask them. No pressure then, Margaret. Right, finally then, of our structured contributors, friend of ours who needs no introduction, but Margaret Hodge.
Thanks, Nathan. And to be absolutely honest, I sort of so agree with everything that's been said before. So I'm going to try and say something that is does provoke a little bit of a debate. I mean, I think I want to start with the Sue Gray report, because Sue Gray is a civil servant. She's had to say it in the context of the outrageous behaviour by the Met in intervening so late. But I think it's an excoriating report. I think it is absolutely, for a civil servant, in the language she uses. 12 events investigated by the police, 3 new events we didn't know about. Boris Johnson, we now know, was present, so he deliberately lied to Parliament. And I think we can, more and more people are saying that. And then if you cut through all that civil service jargon, unacceptable behaviour, standards not upheld, failure of leadership and judgment, and too much booze. You know, I think it's a pretty damning report. So what impact will it have? And I think one of the joys of us, and particularly you in convening this, is that we can spend much time trying to fathom out that impact, and we'll probably all get it horribly wrong. And that's the joy of politics. And when I try to think about it, I'm trying to think about the differences in the past and today, the much greater volatility in the electorate today than there was in the past, and also what are the contemporary circumstances, and how can we in Labour place those contemporary circumstances in our traditional values to make us electable. We want to win. That's what this is all about. When I think about my own by-election, which you asked me to think about, I came in 1994, and then there was a general election in 1997. And for me, actually, sleaze at that time, when I think back, when I started thinking about it, it wasn't the key issue. It was just part of the tapestry that underpinned an attitude and a response to the Tories. Actually, I didn't really have to talk about the Tories in 94 because they were already so loathed and discredited. And I think that came out of, really, it was back to the economy stupid. They lost it on Black Wednesday. That was the tipping point for the Tory, for Major's government. So, and we've got to think about that, and culture, politics and all that. We also had a very divided party at that time, divided over Europe. They'd run out of steam. I don't know if people remember the absurdity of the cones. You know, they were trying to get an initiative by talking about the importance of cones, as well as back to basics. But they had really lost connection with their voters. And I think that's with the voters, and I think that's important. The other thing, just to put it a little bit into context, because we've had the defection last week, is the stream of defections we were getting then. And the importance of that was really, it sort of gave permission for people who had in the past voted Tory to think, could they do it again? I'm going to share with you my own story of that, because Alan Howarth was, I like to take a little bit of credit for getting him over into the Labour Party. When I became an MP in 94, Tessa Giles said to me, we had pairs in those days, and she said, pair with Alan Howarth because he's got a disabled daughter. So I did. And of course, there were more Tories than Labour, so they were all desperate to pair with me. So I did pair with Alan, and he was brilliant to me in those early days when I was trying to find my feet in Westminster. And then his marriage split up. And I said to my assistant, God, he's been so kind to me. I've got to take him out to lunch. So I asked him for lunch, took him to a pretty posh restaurant. And as I left the office, I said, oh God, I'm dreading this. All he's going to talk about is how terrible women are and how awful relationships can be. So we sat down in this restaurant, started chatting, and I was waiting for the onslaught about relationships and women. And all I got was how terrible the Tory party was. And he went on and on. First of all, I said to him, well, he'd just been higher education minister. He could have gone off and run LSE. I said, you could reform the party or work on the inside in the way that we all had in the 80s. And then I said, of course, Alan, we'd love to have you in the Labour Party. And he said, yes, please. But it was a lovely, lovely story. But also what's important, and it all took place outside Westminster, which is how we managed to keep it secret. But what's important about it was, I think that whole thing, that is a very important, that defections is an important sort of symbolic way in which we can add people into, bring people along to the Labour. Sleaze did contribute to the breakdown in trust. I think that's the contribution it made in the tapestry. In those days, it was about sex. Think about David Mello. Think about Tim Yeo. In particular, I think about him, who fathered an illegitimate child, but banged on publicly, talking about the how we had to stop breaking up broken families, and we had to reduce the number of single parents. And it was also, interesting enough, in those days about gay sex as well. There were some sleaze stories which would never appear today about gay sex. But sleaze was also about things like arms to Iraq. Some of you remember that. It was also about the cash for questions that others have talked about. And it was Jonathan Aitken, do you remember, taking bribes from the Saudi Arabians? It was about all that. But in my by-election, Nathan, I could absolutely dismiss the Tories. It was really interesting. They weren't relevant. I didn't focus on sleaze. What I focused on was hospital waiting lists. I focused on school funding. You know, there were schools with actually roofs leaking in those days and buckets under on the floor to catch the water, and crime. And then I talked about local issues. And I think a lesson from then, a lesson today, a lesson I always say very often at these events, all politics starts from the local. Tip O'Neill, great book that he wrote as Speaker of the House of Representatives in the 70s and 80s. And so people wanted to talk about local issues. So what about today? What do I learn from that? I think the sleaze is different. It is about the Prime Minister, and it never was before. And I think that does make a difference. It is also something that impacts on all of us, as everybody said. I think that makes a difference. It's certainly not about sex. Otherwise, Boris Johnson would be top of the sleaze list. And it does feel to me, and this is entirely a feel, it does feel like a bit of a tipping point. But it has to come together with the cost of living, the tax rises, the continuing impact of Brexit, and all those other issues. But we're not sure how they're going to play out with an electorate that is so much now concentrates so much of it on culture and identity politics. And I'm going to say this, the polls are not good enough. I think actually Paula gave us some polls which are better than the ones we had at the weekend. We're now, despite all this sleaze, only 5 points ahead. But we do, you know, and we go back to the volatility and remember Scotland. I'm talking about winning. Nobody has mentioned Scotland and the mountain we have to climb. And I agree entirely with Paula, but that's what we're getting on the doorstep. It's people are now, they don't know. So they're moving away from the Conservatives, but they're not moving to us. But on having said, and this brings me 2 minutes, if I may, on the report I've written. I think we have to bang on about sleaze, because I think the sleaze is much more serious than even about these party gates. I've been working on the issue of financial crime and tax evasion and avoidance and economic crime for the last decade or so. And we have become the jurisdiction of choice for all dirty money across the world. And what I now see is that is beginning to infect our public domain. And that's why I think the issue goes beyond the COVID issue. If you look, let me take a little step back. If you look what this government has done, it's totally undermined all those fragile pillars of democracy that are so important in a country that is democratic but hasn't got a written constitution. So undermining the judiciary, when we had the finding against them on the proroguing of Parliament, where they're trying to cut back on judicial review and where they're trying to change the way that they appoint judges. Undermining Parliament itself. I think the best example, or they didn't get away with it, was Owen Paterson. But if you look at the way that select committees are treated today as to how they were 5 years ago, that has really, really changed. And Parliament's scrutiny of legislation is hopeless. Undermining of the civil service. We've seen more sackings of permanent secretaries, often just in the papers before they're even told themselves, is another pillar of the democracy that's being undermined. And undermining the fourth estate from refusing to allow people into Downing, invite people into Downing Street, to the recent attack on the BBC. All of these fragile pillars of democracy are being undermined. And there is now corruption in our politics. We've heard, fortunately, in the last few days, a little bit about Russian money in our politics. I'm going to give the Chanukins one example. Came here in 2004 on a golden visa because they brought a lot of Russian money into the country. They've given over £2 million into the Tory party. And Chanukin's wife, Lubov, is the one who's infamous for playing tennis with both Boris Johnson and David Cameron. Fedotov is a really interesting character. He was he was exposed in the recent Pandora papers, and he has funded over 20 individual conservatives and conservative parties. He wanted to get the pipeline through from Portsmouth to France and didn't succeed in that. You look at the cash for peerages and the way in which Johnson completely ignores the committee. Peter Cruddas was a good example. You look at the Jockey Club and the influence there on politics. It is scary. You look at cash for access, and we had the Mohammed Amerseed revealing all that in the Sunday Times. You look at the contracts, the COVID contracts, the fast lane. You look at the revolving door. And you really see that the sleaze that we had in our economy is now infecting our public realm, our politics, and undermining our democracy. So I think it's really important that for actually the health and future of our democracy, that Labour doesn't let this go. And I think one of the things I always feel is don't just focus on the Partygate, awful that it is, but actually put it into the context of everything else. And then we need to make the most of that issue, but we do need, as everybody else has said, a positive vision, which is simple. It is simple, but I'm afraid I can't remember beyond respect the three words we're now supposed to be using. That is not like education, 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 and it's not like we'll get Brexit done. It has to be a simple, positive vision. And we should attack the Tories, not just on sleaze, but on their incompetence on managing public money, their wasting of taxpayers' money, and their failure to run the economy well. And then we should show what Steve has said, just competence, which I think Rachel Reeves in particular is doing extremely effectively. But beyond that, we have to show that we have got very few. We had 5 pledges in 97, 5 simple pledges that just hit the key issues, not a massively worked out ridiculous program. 5 pledges show from those values, from a simple, sorry about this, from a simple but positive vision, how we would translate that into action. Thanks, and I've lost my voice, sorry. This is post-COVID.
There we go. I didn't unmute myself. Margaret is actually under the weather over the weekend, so thank you very much for still continuing with this. And I echo the words of Councillor Janice Duffy in the chat, although it sounds a bit obsequious maybe. Margaret, we need more like you, says one of the people in the chat room. Here. It's a shame you're standing down. Right, okay, so I said we've got about 15 minutes, maybe 20, if we could just dribble over like a couple of minutes after 7 o'clock. I've actually constructed 3 questions, I think, bringing together some of the questions that are in the chat. So if everyone's happy, I will ask those questions. And in part, again, Margaret has also covered, answered some of the things I was going to ask, but I think if a bit of repetition is not a bad thing. So the first one, a lot of people have raised issues here about just the mendacity, right, and the scale almost of systematic lying, essentially coming out from the government, and it's increasing uncanny parallels with the Trumpian, the Trump government, basically, about actually government by misinformation. So I guess there's a question here. What can, none of us have known a government like this, but actually, I guess the first question to Paula is, I mean, to what extent does the polling suggest that this actually is having cut through? Or, in that awful expression he's popularized, have we all baked it in to the Johnson persona and style of politics, that we've become much more laissez-faire about the concept of lying in public life? But for the other two, for Margaret, Steve, and for Paula, I mean, to what extent actually do you think that, or Paula, I guess, from a psychological point of view, and Margaret and Steve from a political point of view, to what extent could that potentially be the golden cut through issue about proving that this government essentially is crooked in thought and deed? They're my words, not yours. I'm not expecting you to echo them. So Paula, I'll start with you.
Thank you. So we hear this phrase a lot. It's kind of, it's priced in with Johnson. People know he's like that. All these kind of phrases that we hear, and I think that's true about some things. So I think it's why the Akuri case doesn't cut through, for example, because that kind of behaviour is priced in. Yeah. But this, I think, is different because it feels so personal to people, and it's all very well having this sort of slightly clownish character who breaks the rules when you feel like that person is on your side and doing things for you, sort of them and us against Parliament in the context of Brexit, for example. It's completely different when they're breaking the rules they expected you to abide by in a time of crisis. So I don't think that the kind of allegations around Partygate in particular are going to go away. And I don't actually think the public care much whether he lied or not. That's obviously the crucial question for Parliament, but I don't think the public care all that much. They will read that there were, what was it, 12 parties
by the sounds of it, yeah.
investigated. I don't think they'll need to wait to find out whether or not he told the truth about them in Parliament. I think it cuts through at that emotional level, and everybody can take one of those dates and tell a story about the thing that they missed out on that day because they were following the rules.
Okay, then Steve, and then Margaret. Again, this level of mendacity and potential lying is just off the charts. Is record breaking, isn't it? I mean, we've not been here before in the last 50, 60 years.
Yeah, I mean, a few words on this. So it's all baked in stuff, as Paula was saying. I never believed that. And I agree with her that what actually happened to explain this rapport he had with certain parts of the electorate was that brilliant, I mean, very dangerous, but brilliant juxtaposition of people versus Parliament. Somehow he got himself allied, marching with the people against the elites. And people feel a great sense of rapport with someone who claims to be doing this with them on their behalf, having been betrayed by the elite and the elected Parliament. And I've always thought that meant that the rest of it, the odd fling and all, good old Boris, but they didn't think he was this liar. They thought he was the one delivering for them. Now all this has come along, and betrayal is one of the most common and dangerous emotions of voters. Sometimes they feel betrayed unfairly, but this, what is it, 12 police, investigation to 12 parties or whatever, it will tap into a sense of betrayal. But Margaret's reminded those of us on this Zoom what Labour should do with this, because it is possible Johnson will go, and he's associated with this. Hearing that list of other things that have gone on, have forgotten some of them, and I follow this day in, day out. So they need to make that wider case. Margaret's about to do it in this report about some of these other things that have gone on, which affect public money, which affect patronage, and all the other abuses, because that makes it, in the end, a more enduring, powerful case. But I think these voters now, Paula will have more information about their precise kind of feelings about all of this. But the logic is, if they have turned against him, they will feel betrayed. And if they feel betrayed, it wasn't baked in that he was like this. And so, you know, I think this is quite a moment in the relationship between the electorate and Johnson.
Completely. I mean, there's another piece of work we're hoping to bring out either next month or March, looking at the way in which Johnson, as a communicator, is very direct. It's all these 3-word slogans. It's I'm going to get X, Y, and Z done. And I do wonder now whether the tipping point is, if we're not quite there, whether it's there, that actually it's almost that molten level of anger, because people will think they've been diddled by the ultimate elitist, right? And it is basically that he becomes the archetypal populist for the 21st century, and really taking, pardon my language, anyone out there under the age of 16, but he ends up taking the piss, and it becomes sort of, there is no way out for government that said. Margaret, any thoughts on the levels of mendacity and...
Well, the only thing I mean, he is a compulsive and inveterate liar. I did the a review of the Garden Bridge for Sadiq in the early days, and he refused to come and give evidence, but just looking through all the papers, he just lies. He just lies with absolute and utter and total impunity. He's an inveterate liar. I think the problem is a problem for the political class, and that's the only thing that I'd sort of put a little bit of a break on this thing, that that's good. You know, we're going to be able to establish hatred of him because of his compulsive lying, because we're all seen as liars. I mean, I think we underplay the importance of the expensive scandal and the legacy that that's given us all, and lack of trust in the political class. It's still a job that needs to be completed and doing so. I think it's really difficult to put him in a different category from the rest of us, who are all tarnished and tarred with the expenses scandal. So, you know, I mean, I hope that's why I would love to see it in this wider context. He is an absolute, you know, maybe he's gone, but all the stuff that they've been doing, undermining democracy, and all the stuff that they've been doing and bringing corruption, this money into corruptly impacting on politics, I think is the bigger story that I just wish Labour would latch onto and just say time and time again in very, very simple language. Corrupt money has infected corrupt politics.
Can't disagree with that. Okay, second question then. I think some of you already we've touched upon this, but it comes back to this issue of the holy grail of actually how do we get to that magical point where Tory voters cross over to Labour, or indeed a majority of the don't knows come over decisively into the Labour column. And actually we published some work on this with Chris Curtis back in September. But I just wondered, I think I'll start with Steve on this one, and then on to Margaret, and then come to you third, Paula. Any reflections from what we've done before, both in living memory or going back to when Steve was in his crib? What Labour can do and what it has to do to start reframing the argument and the discussion, because you're right, I think we're not going to get to a point where we can construct and promote a positive message if it is all 100% built on the decaying foundations of the present government. So actually, what do we need to do to seal the deal with don't knows to actually be in a position to go forward bright, competent morning again in time for the next general election? So Steve, then Margaret, then Paula.
It's a good question, because as I think it was Margaret, it might have been Paula, has said that with the major years, it wasn't sleaze, it was Britain falling out of the exchange rate mechanism. That single event changed everything. And let's not forget, that was pre-Tony Blair. September 1992, the Tories were never ahead in the polls again. And there's unlikely to be such a seismic moment because it doesn't happen that often, unless what we're living through at this very moment is an equivalent, a very different kind of equivalent. But I doubt it. And therefore it is, and there wasn't an equivalent in the build-up to 64. Therefore, it is exactly as you say. In opposition, it's about the framing of arguments and how you project your wider case. This is going beyond sleaze now. So no one else can remember Starmer's 3 chosen themes. I'm sad enough that I can't remember this thing of prosperity, security, and respect. That was the other one. Now, you know, actually, that's not that different to what Wilson and Blair did. You choose as your broadest themes terms that no one can oppose. Who's against being prosperous? Who's against respect? Who wants to be insecure? But you then must frame arguments that have distinctive, coherent appeal. So you could take security to mean much more than crime and international defense. You could put within that the NHS and social care and other things. And so you begin to develop and go beyond those clearly forgettable banalities. And the New Labour technique was a good one. You can't emulate all that period. It's a different world. Yeah. But those dividing lines were highly effective. And you have to appear as if you own the future, that you are the future, not anybody else. And that is artistry, really. I would be worried if I were Keir Starmer if every time he made a speech, the entire commentariat said, oh, he's Blair, oh, he's Miliband. Oh, you know, the winners are themselves. That, you know, Blair wasn't compared to Wilson. Wilson wasn't compared to Gateskill. They just became the future. And that's what you've got to do in opposition. And it's not easy. And as I say, it's partly artistry, but also huge amounts of work and framing.
Sorry, I was being good then. I've muted myself. Thanks, Steve. Margaret, what do you think?
Well, I want to say two things. One is about leadership. Leadership counts. And do you remember Blair in the early years was Bambi? And then was it Lenin? Anyway, Stalin, I can't remember what. So I think Keir, you know, he still has got to work to build, and then eventually, you know, became quite populist. He became a populist leader who did connect with the voters. So I think the one thing is if we're going to, the tipping point maybe there, we have to have the leadership, and there may be something. I think, you know, who can tell that the flamboyance of Johnson, people may be completely and utterly fed up with it, and may want that sort of much more solid, reliable man of integrity that comes with the DPP and Keir's persona. So that's the first thing. The second thing I was going to say is a bit more difficult. You see, I still remember education. I still remember tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. I still remember rights and responsibilities and all those. And I still remember from that, and we must think about the potency of get Brexit done, or I'm getting on with a job. Those very simple phrases, which I'm afraid prosperity, security, and respect don't quite do for me. And to say something which probably will go down okay here, but won't go down elsewhere, there's a lot of time. I mean, I was part of you know, I was involved with the people in the 92 when John Smith thought it would be one more heave, and you know, that was the sort of the Tories would lose and we would win because they would lose. And there were a lot of us who thought this wasn't good enough, and there was a lot of thinking about how would we evolve this sort of very simple value base on which we could then construct politics. And we did come and went through a lot of, you know, Will Hutton wrote a book, Anthony Giddens wrote a book, but the basic thought behind it, I think, is still okay for today, except we may have to articulate it in different ways. And it's this juxtaposition. We gave a vision for the future by saying, actually, economic strength and prosperity and social justice and inequality are two sides of the same coin. They both go together. They're not competing objectives and ambition. And that was the very simple value base on which we built everything. I think it's still relevant today. I think with a very different context and with very different priorities and very different challenges. But I think if we can re-articulate that, it's almost getting me added into something that works for today, and then build those very simple messages around key public services or key public issues, maybe the green agenda, it may be, you know, I don't know what it would be, but those, you know, that's up for grabs. I think if we could do that, then attack the Tories on this corruption, which I think is hugely important, attack them on their incompetence, attack them on running out of steam, but then have this very simple vision as an alternative.
Thank you, Margaret. If I can just sort of come in there. Margaret and I were at an event before Christmas, and I think we both agreed what was being said. It's actually, how do we do that piece of work today, which looks at the intellectual and political necessity for us to be on the front foot? It's how do we go back to the enduring sort of principles and values of the Labour Party as expressed in the 90s or before? We have to reframe them for the context of today. And I think that's part of the reason why we're running this series, because there's a lot of interest in Labour history, but sometimes it becomes a bit of a binary ding dong that it's either this or that, and we can just take what worked in the past and redo it today. We can't. We have to rethink what we did in the past to ensure it suits for today. But I think I'd echo Margaret's sentiments. Paula, now I don't want to get you in hot water by coming forward with too many political suggestions what Labour should do, but is there anything in the polling that kind of really jumps out at you that suggests where Labour could be looking at to have that greater cut through?
That's all right. I'll say some of the things I think Labour should do. I do it often enough on Twitter. I think I'll say something about the current messaging first, because I think this is really important. And I noticed it. I mean, there wasn't much of substance that Johnson said today in the House, but he came up with this phrase again, which I've been hearing a lot, and that is the people's priorities.
Yeah.
And I don't know, one or two of you may have spotted it popped up with capital letters in a Priti Patel WhatsApp a couple of weeks ago. And I think it's really important for Labour at the moment to resist the temptation to throw everything at Partygate, because it makes space for that argument. It makes space for that argument that Labour doesn't care, that people are struggling, and all the other things that are going on. So I do think that needs to be neutralised. And I think I wouldn't necessarily be leading on Partygate on Wednesday, let's put it that way. In terms of the polling, I think you also have to accept that there are some voters that are not coming back. So you can't win back everybody. That isn't going to happen. I think there's probably now I don't think that the British electorate are entirely polarised, but I think there are bits at each end that are, and those voters that have gone to, they're never coming back to Labour, no matter what you do. And you have to accept that and look at the coalition that you can build. I think the current polling, notwithstanding the issues with the don't knows, but may actually be slightly better for Labour than it looks, because there are votes for the Greens and the Lib Dems, which we know are likely to be squeezed or used tactically in an actual general election. So that might make the polling look a little bit better for Labour when they were actually cast as votes rather than vote intentions. So there are some positive signs there as well. But I think Labour's messages now have to also be on linking these scandals to issues that matter to people more. So let's suppose, for example, Sunak became leader of the Conservatives before the next election. I don't know how that might come about, but it might. At the last, when was it? 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Labour were putting out videos attacking his £100 coffee mug. That, I think, is the wrong attack line, because that's about how he spends his money. The attack line is how he spends your money. And that links straight back into these issues of PPE contracts, people taking private jets instead of flying with a normal airline. All those kinds of things can be linked together and tied up with what the Conservative Party does, rather than what an individual within it does. And then you haven't got that danger down the line of a sudden big polling bounce just before an election when a new leader comes along.
Okay, cheers, Paula. If people are okay with just another 10 minutes, I've got one substantive question and one quick fire. Is everyone okay with that? No one's shaking their head, so I'll take that as a yes. So the question that I've got here is from Anthony Broxton. So Anthony, as I said earlier, is the man behind the Tides of History website, and also the Tides of History Twitter page, which is very popular, which is why we're buddying up with him. So basically, Anthony says, what role does the media play in all of this? In the 90s, it was in the paper's interest to find more and more sleaze stories. Will the newspapers sustain the pressure on Johnson, or do you think they will move on? And actually, there was something I was thinking about earlier on when Margaret was talking about the expenses scandal. and I don't want to, I promise I haven't put my tinfoil hat on, but to what extent do roads lead back to the Telegraph and the Barclay brothers and that sort of nexus of, for the UK at least, the hard right wing sort of interest in the newspaper industry, who are sustaining Boris Johnson and, quite frankly, a pretty poor government around him in the face of scandals that they would have been sort of flaying people alive for in previous regimes. So Margaret, I'll start with you first. Damn it, says Margaret.
Yeah, no, it's just too difficult a question. And I was hoping you'd go to Steve first.
All right then. Well, Steve, I'll go. In which case, I'll be nice. I'll go to Steve first.
Well, I'll say two things. First of all, it's one of the great mysteries in life that no one buys newspapers now, but they remain incredibly influential in shaping the way lots of people think, not least the BBC, for example. I've noticed when the Mail and the Telegraph go really hard on Johnson over this, the BBC are very confident about leading with it and all the rest of it. They've almost been given permission by the papers to be robust. And then, as has happened recently, when the Mail and Telegraph, put it elsewhere and say, look, there are more important things, that they stop leading with it. Now sometimes it's coincidence, but sometimes it has a big impact. For example, on the Today program, I don't think people realize it's this cocooned office in Broadcasting House, and really the only outside world stuff they have is when the first editions arrive, and that has a huge influence on their thinking. Now, what the papers will do with this is what they did with John Major. They will try, clearly at the Mail, a decision has been taken to try and help him. If you look at the headlines of recent days, a war is about to start and Britain is talking about whether cake was taken in number 10, this kind of thing. And they will carry on with that if their political team feed into the editors that they think he's going to survive. The moment they think he's finished, those papers will turn. And one of the problems Major had really is that he never recovered his relationship with the Tory newspapers after the ERM crash. And then the David Mellor sex thing, the front pages of the Sun mocking Mellor, going for Major, and they all really went for him. So although I think, this is unfashionable, I think Alistair Campbell did an important job between 94 and 97 in wooing the papers and just around the clock and pleasing the Sun, and it was a nightmare for him, but I think he had to do it. But to some extent, he and Blair were knocking at an open door because they turned on Major. Now, that might happen in the coming days with Boris Johnson. I'm just sort of occasionally looking at Twitter. He's getting a terrible response from the media about his performance this afternoon, including Tory political journalists. If the Mail and the Telegraph turn permanently and the Sun, he's finished, is my reading of it. So that's how important they are in this saga and the future for Labour.
I can add to that, Nathan, if you like. I mean, the one thing is Johnson gave a terrible performance today. It was an absolutely abysmal performance.
Were you in the Commons, Margaret?
No, I was at Jack Dromey's funeral.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
But he, the bits I've watched, it was terrible. We haven't talked about social media. That's the only thing that, the impact of social media and how people consume their news. One interesting thing, the day after a Labour Party conference, I went to a school in Barking, talked to the sixth formers, and it was, Keir had put a huge amount of effort into that conference speech. It was a real, absolutely huge moment for him. So I was there with 100 sixth formers, so they're, potential voters. And I said, so how many of you watched Keir yesterday or saw anything that he said? Not one person put up their hands. So let's just be a little bit, remember the role of the media. And the other thing I would put in as a thought, that at the 97 election, I hope I've got this fact right, I think I have, at the 97 election, when the Mail was still urging everybody to vote Conservative, for all 40% of Mail readers actually voted Labour. So important though the media is, you can actually get the vote, attract the vote, and attract people's sort of confidence and reconnect with them in other ways too.
Well, don't worry about the veracity of that. If it transpires you were wrong, I'll get our friends on a bot farm to come in and edit in the right figure, so no one says that you're trying to mislead them. Paula, any thoughts from you on how the media, what role the media plays, or indeed how that has a bearing on people's perceptions?
So I've got three short points to make about this. The first is just Margaret's point there about the Mail reminded me of some research I was involved in back in '92 that showed that the majority of Sun readers thought they read a left-wing newspaper. Yeah. So I don't think we can always be a bit, we can always assume the effect of the media is a bit too much.
Can I just say one thing on that, Paula? I just think that means they must have thought, my God, we're reading a left-wing newspaper and they hate the Labour Party. It must be even more useless than I thought, and voted accordingly. Anyway, that's always been my theory about it.
I think picking up the social media point, and also the way that things are, they kind of need to fill podcasts and blogs and everything else at the moment. I think there's a danger that it could become a bit trivializing. I thought that was happening last week when we were starting to talk about cakes to a ridiculous extent, where people were trying to find the next big story, and it turned out to be, there wasn't enough candles on the cake or something like that. So I think there's a danger that people keep chasing the story and trivialize it as a result. But I think the other thing, again, linking in with what Margaret was saying, there was this real sense, I think, before all this started, that Starmer was still really quite unknown in the public. And one of the side effects of this crisis is that he's being seen speaking in Parliament on the news on a very regular basis. And we're starting to see that in increases in his poll ratings, not just decreases in Johnson's. And I think that might be an important unanticipated side effect of this particular crisis.
Correct. I mean, coming into what Steve said about the BBC, as a refugee from the newsroom myself, being there in the high pomp of the second term of the Labour government, the Daily Mail was the most read and feared and anticipated paper that we pored over at every meeting, every morning meeting. What is the Daily Mail line? What is the angle? What can we do? How can we not say X, Y, and Z that will get us into hot water? It's one of the reasons I left. But there we go. Things don't change. Last one then, quick fire. And I guess it's from a point of view, from a various points of view. So I have a question here from Matt Lloyd. If this scandal does take Boris Johnson down, which of the runners and riders in any future leadership should Labour fear the most? So Paula, then Steve, and I'll take you lastly, Margaret.
None of them.
I'll quote you on that one. That is the quote from me. Noted sociologist says.
They're all unknowns, more or less. None of them have the same, Boris Johnson's been described as the Heineken politician that could reach out to these other parts of the electorate. None of them have that. Few of them have the instinct in terms of economic policy to reach out to those communities either. So I don't think there's anybody there that Labour should be particularly afraid of. That's not to say I don't think they'll get polling bounces. I don't think it'll be difficult, but I don't think there's anybody that they should particularly fear.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And fear is paralysing. Labour, and I don't think there's any danger of Labour being complacent, frankly. I mean, they lose so many elections. Complacency would be a bit of a perverse state of mind to be in. But, there will be a honeymoon, whoever gets it. And that will be quite a dangerous time because there will be talk of an early election and all the rest of it. But if they keep their nerves, the likes of Sunak, who is a half-formed politician, before he was Chancellor, he was sort of Chief Secretary, and before that, a junior minister, and Liz Truss would take, another hour to explain her. But neither are threatening. If they go outside the cabinet, it will be a very, unless it's Jeremy Hunt, if they go for a non-person who's never been in the cabinet, it will be such a leap. So I don't think they need fear anyone. And this coalition that was a product of Brexit and Johnson would be quite vulnerable under Sunak or Truss or some of these people. So I agree.
Margaret.
Well, I think Liz Truss is the most likely on current, and what it's really picking on Steve's point. The problem is the honeymoon period, because if she comes in and before she is uncovered and discovered, they go for a general election. That's the danger for Labour. So we've got to be and that if I were them, that's what I'd do. So that's we have got to be, more 150% ready to very, very quickly undermine the credibility of anybody who gets it. If it's Liz Truss, it's probably the easiest to do, but just beware the honeymoon period.
And on that note, folks, I'm going to bring this evening's discussion to a close. We strayed a fair bit from, I think, talk about the historical analogies, but actually, I think all the better for it, because this has been a really, really interesting, stimulating discussion. So thank you again to Paula Surridge, to Steve Richards, and to Margaret Hodge for their time this evening. One last plug that Paula is currently at UK and a Changing Europe, avid blogger, but also recent co-author of the 2019 General Election Study, available in all good bookshops and wherever you buy your products online. Steve, again, it's the Rock and Roll Politics podcast, which I would recommend. Also, Steve has both his books on the prime ministers we got and the ones we never got, are both available online and in the shops of your choice. And Margaret's paper on dirty politics in the UK, after it's been, I think every line is now going to be read through probably after tonight's performance, Margaret. Margaret is expecting her paper to come out at some point next month or March, fingers crossed. My plug is my book, our book comes out next Thursday. It's called Rethinking Labour's Past, which, as I've said, is the name of this series. So we are hopefully having, there'll definitely be an event next month. Next month, the 28th of February is a Monday, which is the day that we've decided to run these. So we're putting together a session on parallels with 1974. The mid-1970s, at one point, the most maligned talking point in Labour's history. I think from the vantage point of the last 10 years, I think some of us have a bit more sympathy with the vicissitudes that politicians had to go through in the 70s. And actually, if you look at it, global economic meltdown, energy prices through the roof, a failing government, what potentially can the Labour Party learn from the success in 1974? And I'll probably get shot by all the new Labour lovers in the room for even daring to say so. But I think with that, as you can all I'll stop that. Right. So thank you very much for coming, everyone. It's been a really, really interesting evening, and have a good night. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.